Hello everyone. So for this video, I'd like to go over some basics of working with modeling beeswax for those people who aren't familiar with using it before or just might like a few extra tips of how to use it before we start the projects that we'll be doing for the intensive. So starting with the products that I use, I do like the Stockmar beeswax. It's a nice consistency and I like the colors that they use. There's a pretty good variety and I tend to use these containers with my upper grades classes. As a rule, I don't worry about which colors I give the students. Sometimes I go for colors that are accurate to the design or project that we're working on, but often I try and get them out of the idea that the color of the beeswax needs to be representational of the thing that we're making. So if you buy it in a container like this, these come unwrapped, but often you'll get the beeswax. If you buy them in 15 packages per box, they come with plastic wrapping on them. And with or without the wrapping, it doesn't make a big difference. But for younger children, you'll want to cut these up beforehand. Using a full-size stick, I wouldn't use this with anyone younger than maybe a 7th grade class. I do use a full-size stick with 8th graders and with adults because they have bigger hands and can get it warmer. But for younger children, you'll want smaller sizes. An 1/8 of a stick might be the right size for an early childhood class. Maybe 1/4 of a stick for a 1st grade class. And 1/2 a stick and on. I might start in about 4th grade or so to use a 1/2 a stick for different projects. And I like to cut those just with a nice pair of scissors. They do get wax on the scissors and it makes them a little hard to clean off. So I keep a pair of scissors that are just for beeswax in my desk at school. Then you'll want to make sure to get all of the plastic off. And sometimes I do give students the beeswax when it is flattened like this, but more frequently I like to have it formed into kind of some smaller balls for them when I give it to them, just to round the edges and makes it a little bit easier to work with. The next step is, as I mentioned, is warming the beeswax. So the beeswax, to be able to model it, really needs to be warmed up. And the best way to do that is with your hands. When you're structuring a modeling or sculpture lesson with your class, it's nice to have some things to start with. So I usually pass out the beeswax first, then we'll do an activity of warming our hands, rubbing them together, doing some hand warm-ups. We'll often do some finger exercises to try and make sure that everything is warmed up and ready. So touching thumbs together, pointers, long fingers, ring fingers, pinkies, and back down. And having the students follow this process, particularly with early childhood or younger grades, this is a great activity. It helps to build some of that midline integration without necessarily crossing it. It builds fine motor control and helps them to begin to isolate these muscle groups. It's a really good way to work into those fingers before the sculpture lesson begins. Once your hands are warmed up, it's the time to warm it. And by just putting a piece of beeswax into your palm and holding it close, you'll be able to get it to warm up. It's important that they not let go, that they not take it out to check on it. If you'd like it to go a little bit faster, you can put the beeswax into your armpit. But I really like to just have the students put it into their hands and hold it close while I'm telling some kind of a story related to the sculpture that we're going to do. While I'm describing the animal or figure or whatever it is that we're going to sculpt, or just telling them or reading them a story, they're waiting for their beeswax to warm. And this takes different amounts of time. I do tend as a teacher to keep at least one extra piece of beeswax in my other hand. I have a few students in my class who have a really hard time warming beeswax up. And sometimes I'll swap out with them my warmed beeswax for the piece that they're still working on so that they'll be able to follow the steps with us. And as that beeswax is warming, you are telling them the story and really starting to talk through the process. Again, I usually have a piece of beeswax that's a little bit ahead of where theirs will be. That way, before their beeswax is really ready to mold, I'll be ready to show them those first steps. Now, depending on where you live and what time of year it is, there's some other ways that you can really get the beeswax to warm a little more readily. You can put it in a basket and put it on the windowsill in the sun. As long as you don't leave it there for too long and it's not in too direct of sunlight or in a really hot climate, it helps to kind of warm and soften it, and then you may be able to start right into the project with minimal story time. In the winter time, if you have forced air heat, you can again put a basket near the heater. I don't recommend putting it on the heater at all, but putting it near the heater in a basket and checking on it periodically. Again, you may be able to warm that beeswax a little bit right before you start your lesson. It can be really helpful to choose when your sculpture classes take place. Having sculpture right after recess can be great in the warm months, but if you live in a place with a pretty cold climate, then the winter time, they may need some time to warm their hands before they're ready to sculpt. So once that beeswax has started to warm, it's important to make sure that it's really malleable, that it's warm all the way through. Sometimes just the outer edges, especially if you're working with a ball, the outer edges may get warmed, but the inside isn't ready. And so when students work with that, they'll wind up moving the wax around the edges, but they won't really be able to work into the center of the beeswax, and that can be frustrating for students. So one thing that I like to have them do is to fold it over, squeeze it back out, and fold it a couple more times. It's important that their hands are clean and dry. If they're working with the beeswax with wet hands, the beeswax will start to laminate. It'll make these sheets that don't stick back together, and that makes a hard time for a sculpture later. And so starting beeswax class with washing and drying their hands, having some time with that, especially again in the early childhood, can be a really nice opportunity to warm the senses before taking on this kind of an activity. And then once it's been folded a few times and they're sure that it's warmed all the way through, I almost always have them start by forming it into a ball. Now, for me, this is one of the places where sculpture has kind of different purpose with the students. And by beginning almost every sculpture with the universal sphere, with the kind of oneness, I think it's a good opportunity for the students to then be able to see how all shapes can be related to one another. It's a really different thing than trying to see the component pieces or the component shapes that may make something up. Also, as a side note, it's a great way to manage time in class because students who work quickly at getting their beeswax ready can spend time smoothing out cracks like this that will appear in the lamination part of folding it and refolding it. And that gives them something to do and starts to really work into their fingers as they start to find new techniques for how to bring the beeswax into the shape and texture that they want it to be. Now, with younger children, that's a pretty hard thing to do, but giving them a chance to work at that is also a really good challenge. And the older they get, the more adept they'll be at being able to warm the beeswax, finding that smooth consistency, and they'll start to really be able to make it into things that they'd like it to be. Now, once you have a nice warm ball of beeswax like this size might be for, again, a first grade student. If you had something a little bit bigger, you might use this in the middle grades and this into the middle and upper grades. And by working in that way, they'll be able to have a piece of beeswax that ideally fits about into the center of their palm. And so for an adult size, you may want something considerably bigger, but for younger children, you want to see that it's something that they can really fit into the palm of their hand. That'll also mean that it's something that they can hold with about 6 fingers. But really, we're encouraging them to work it mostly with the tips of their finger and thumb. I encourage my students all the time to do the entire sculpture holding it and also turning it all the time, so that they're learning that in sculpture, we're looking at things from all angles. I encourage them not to set it down and roll it, for example, but rather to make those kinds of changes by pushing or pulling with their fingertips. And I also encourage them not to make marks on it with tools. That's something that I introduce in the middle and upper grades as kind of a new technique. But when you can really keep them in the younger grades at working to find an archetypal form, as opposed to trying to find the details that they think will make it look like that sculpture, it'll really shift their way of thinking about what the shape and form of something is. And with that, we can start a sculpture. I hope that these tips will be helpful, and please let me know if you have any other questions about the practicalities of working with beeswax with a younger class. In the next video, we'll talk about how to make a human shape in something that I might do with classes and will certainly be useful for the workshop that we're taking. See you soon.